I sent out 3 pieces of information which you can get, I guess, off the internet. One is I did an article in my newsletter, which I call Harper launches a major termination plan, First Nations termination plan, and that's available on the internet. I also did Canada's War on First Nations. That's like a PowerPoint, more of a historical thing, going back from the Doctrine of Discovery right through to the Indian Act, the treaties in the Indian Act up till today. So if anybody wants to look at that, Roger probably has that. And the last thing I did, I was concerned about this I don't know more movement, being kind of shallow in their analysis from what I've been seeing in the media. So I did, my stepdaughter is an actress and producer, Jennifer Brodowski, and she interviewed me and put it up on YouTube. So there's a video of a longer talk I give, which you can get off the internet too. But all 3 of those materials I put out to help give more background information to people just getting involved into the political situation today. I noticed a lot of young people, so I know a lot of them don't have the historical background. So that's why I did those three things recently. But what Roger's asked me to talk about, I guess, is to summarize what I wrote in my article. And basically what I wrote in the article, covering basically the past 40 years of what's gone on from the 1969 White Paper, when Pierre Trudeau was the Prime Minister and John Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs. They had a white paper in Indian policy where they proposed a number of measures basically to assimilate Indians and to terminate their rights, and that was get rid of the treaties, get rid of the reserves, repeal the Indian Act, amend the Constitution to remove any references to Indians and Indian lands. There was a number of measures in there. And of course, First Nations, Indian people across Canada rose up and rejected that, and the government, that's when the Indians of Alberta Association presented the red paper in 1971 to Trudeau and them. And publicly, they said they weren't going to push the white paper, but, we've got documents internally from the bureaucracy saying, well, they're just going to extend the time frame, because they were proposing to do that within 5 years. So what they did was they extended the time frame. So the bureaucracy has still been implementing the white paper, but they've been doing it in components rather than as a whole, like trying to change the legal and political status of Indians. And so, throughout the 70s, there was some talk of amending the Indian Act, but the National Indian Brotherhood at the time, didn't accept that. They had some strong leaders at the time, George Manuel, also from Saskatchewan. I'm getting old here. Noel Starblanket. Noel Starblanket was pretty strong too, and so in the 70s, the Trudeau government didn't push too hard. And then, of course, in 1980, Trudeau proposed patriating Canada's Constitution, and that led us into the whole fight, about being included in the Constitution or not being included, because there was a debate about that amongst different leaders and First Nations across Canada. In the end, Section 35 was put in the Constitution, and there were some treaty nations and some from BC that went and fought against it in England in court too, but they lost. But when the court decision came down, they said Canada could patriate the Constitution, but they had to respect the treaties as long as the promises in the treaties, as long as the sun shines and the grass grows. And that was Justice Denning that handed down that decision in England. And so, some of you are probably old enough to remember the constitutional talks in the 80s, and that was supposed to define what Aboriginal treaty rights were in the meaning of Section 35 in the Constitution. But those talks ended in failure because, by 1987, that was the last meeting, and Mulroney, the meeting ended and he didn't, move to create any more meetings. He was already in secret talks with Premier Bourassa to develop what became the Meech Lake Accord. And they were focusing on Quebec's distinct society and ignoring First Nations issues then, in terms of constitutional reform. But, we saw what happened in 1990. That's when the so-called Oka crisis happened. My reserve, Ganawagi, blocked the Mercier Bridge. after a SWAT team attacked our sister community, Gunnesadage, for an expansion of a golf course to our community over there near burial ground and 100-year-old stand of white pines that our people had planted. And that led to a 78-day standoff. And coming out of that standoff, Moroney announced 4 pillars to a policy where he announced what would become the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. He said he would accelerate the settlement of native claims and that he would improve, the socio-economic conditions. After that, he tried the Charlottetown Accord, and of course that ended after a Canada-wide referendum in 1992. And so, nothing came out of that. Section 35 really wasn't resolved, and then the court started to interpret it with the Sparrow case in 1990, and they've handed down a number of cases affecting Aboriginal rights and treaty rights. In terms of Section 35, they've laid out legal tests for any time a group asserts an Aboriginal right or a treaty right under Section 35. And to meet those legal tests, to collect the evidence and to sustain constitutional arguments in court cost millions and millions of dollars. And most communities, First Nations can't afford that. And so the government's been taking advantage of that, the fact that most of the communities are in poverty. And what they've done, is develop these policies for negotiation. And when Chrétien got into power, he had a majority government in 1993. In 1995, Chrétien, the guy who was behind the white paper, introduced a 1995 Aboriginal self-government policy. And they call it the inherent right policy, but it's anything but inherent right, because what that policy does is it says what's on the table and what's not on the table for negotiating self-government. They're basically saying, okay, all you Indians are in the Indian Act. If you want out of the Indian Act, then you have to negotiate your way out through the self-government policy. And the terms of the self-government policy are all matters of national interest are off the table. That means all federal powers. So all powers related to trade and commerce really are not to be shared with First Nations. Canada's keeping that for themselves. And for provincial areas of provincial jurisdiction, the provinces have a veto. For example, I noticed you guys were negotiating a self-government agreement before your council for child welfare. Well, the way that policy works is whether it's sectoral agreements like child welfare or education or health or whatever, or a whole self-government agreement covering all of that, any areas that go into the provincial government's area of jurisdiction, they have a veto over it. In other words, if they don't like how far you're going in asserting that you have some authority, they could say, no, we don't agree with that. And the federal government wouldn't agree. And that's why the federal government's always saying you have to have minimum standards, and by that, in the contribution agreements, and by that they mean provincial standards, no matter what area it is, education or child welfare or whatever. Because during the Constitution, the talks in the 80s, what was being talked about was a First Nations order of government as a distinct order of government with recognized territories and jurisdiction. Well, that didn't happen. So what they're trying to do now is say, okay, we already have federal powers and provincial powers in the Constitution. And what they're trying to do is turn, using that self-government policy, they're trying to get, before 1982, according to Canadian law, they could unilaterally extinguish Aboriginal and treaty rights. But since 1982, they need Indian consent. So that's how come they're coming up with these policies of negotiation, is to try and get First Nations to self-terminate under these policies. Now, the self-government one has been there since 1995, but they've also had the specific claims policy and the comprehensive claims policy since 1973. And the comprehensive claims policy is the land claims policy for areas where historic treaties haven't been made, like British Columbia, Quebec, Atlantic, parts of Ontario. I know Lubicon was saying they weren't covered under Treaty 8, so they were arguing Aboriginal title in their territory. And specific claims are for areas, they're lawful obligations, which usually include treaties, breaches of treaties or reserve lands or trust funds. And of course, if you get a settlement, specific claims settlement, you have to extinguish any other claims you have against the government in accepting that money. So there is extinguishment involved in specific claims, and in comprehensive claims, you have to agree to extinguish your Aboriginal title in exchange for a modern treaty. So between the self-government policy and the land claims policies, it's all about extinguishment or terminating your rights in the long run. And there's 92 tables. I said there was 93 tables in my article, but I've since seen a community notice to the Blood Tribe saying they wrote a letter to Aboriginal Affairs asking to be taken off the list because they're no longer pursuing the self-government agreement. So there's 92 tables now instead of 93. And there's a list on the Aboriginal Affairs website, so you can see province by province which tables are there. And, with the Harper government coming into power, from Chrétien, I left off with the 1990s in Chrétien and the 1995 self-government policy. The other thing he tried to do was amend the Indian Act in 1996 and 97. And I was working for Ovid McCurdy at AFN at the time. I was the Indian Act Amendments coordinator. So it was my job to study the amendments to see if it was better or worse than the status quo. And I had, of course, technical people assisting me, lawyers and also other policy people. And we did an analysis, and our report to the chiefs was that the proposed amendment package was worse than the status quo, and we recommended the chiefs oppose it. And they went through it, and they took our advice, and it was Ron Irwin, who was the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time, under Jean Chrétien as Prime Minister. And we fought that legislation, and we beat them. In the end, they called it the Indian Act Optional Modification Act. And, most of it was developed by the bureaucrats within Indian Affairs. They were the ones that put in all the amendments that they wanted to better control and manage Indians, from Ottawa. So, we had reasons as to why we opposed it. Those were the main ones, was that it was going to bring more control, not less control. And so they called the election, and that died on the order paper. But then in 2000, Chrétien had, also the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples came down in 1996. Chrétien said they were already doing the things recommended in the Royal Commission's report. And, they had recommended $10 billion more in spending for 10 years, and Chrétien said that was too much money. So they just shelved that Royal Commission report and didn't do anything about it. But then in 2000, he replaced his Minister of Indian Affairs, I think it was Jane Stewart, and then he replaced her with Bob Nault. And Bob Nault came in, and he started trying to pass what was called the First Nations Governance Act, which really was repackaging of the Indian Act Amendments package that Ron Irwin tried to push in 96 and 97. But again, it was a way of trying to create national standards of control over First Nations in terms of governance and administration. So again, I was involved in an AFN implementation committee with leaders and technicians, and we fought that legislation too, and we wound up beating that again. The time ran out on it, but also Paul Martin had spoken up about it, and that helped us defeat it because Chrétien kind of backed off a bit then because they were in a bit of a leadership fight at the time. So there's been an attempt to keep trying to impose these new laws, amending the Indian Act, or bringing in new laws to control and manage Indians, with a view to gradually eliminating rights over time, because that's what these laws are about. It's just kind of managing the extinction of Indians over a period of time rather than within a 5-year time frame, like the white paper proposed. And so after Chrétien was gone, Paul Martin came in and he did the roundtables, and everybody participated in those, and I think he spent about a year or two on those. And that all led up to the Kelowna Accord. But the thing they did before the Kelowna Accord was AFN signed a protocol agreement in May of 2005, I think it was, where they said they'd look at the comprehensive claims policy to reform it and the self-government policy, and also they would be looking at historic treaties, because Canada doesn't have a policy on historic treaties. The only policy they have is a self-government one, and they're saying, write in the policy that it has to be clear that it's not the treaty, whatever agreement comes out of those talks. So it's not treaty rights that comes out of those self-government talks. Anyway, so they signed that protocol and to change those policies, but then they came up with the Kelowna Accord. And the criticism I had was they were separating rights from programs and services by having two different processes. And, a political accord for the treaty rights and Aboriginal rights policies, and one for program and service delivery. In other words, they were trying to say programs and services are just social policy issues and not based on rights. And that's what the Kelowna Accord was about. They were going to come up with money, but they were also lumping in status Indians in with the Métis and the Inuit and urban Aboriginal people. And the provinces didn't want the feds to offload status Indian responsibilities for funding onto them. That's how come they didn't come up with any money, and in the Kelowna Accord they didn't reach any agreement on accepting any responsibilities. All that money was supposed to come from the federal government. And Paul Martin, he didn't even set it up for the thing to be real. To me, it was a pre-election photo op he was doing because he knew that his government was going to fall. So to me, he wasn't really sincere about the Kelowna Accord. But in any case, the election happened, the Kelowna Accord, the Conservatives said they weren't going to implement it. When they came in 2006, and, they had a minority government, so they were slow in trying to implement their plans. But if you look at the Conservatives' 2006 election platform, the Aboriginal part, they call it, it's all about Indian issues. It's not Métis or Inuit issues. They want to have the reserves opened up for access for economic development. That's where Manny Jules' private ownership, actually it's Harper's initiative, but Manny Jules is promoting it, and Tom Flanagan. Private ownership on reserves, modernizing the Indian Act. That's where this whole suite of legislation comes in. All of it comes from their 2006 platform. The promises they made if they got elected in 2006. And so because they were a minority government, they didn't act on it until they got a majority. So that's why now that they have a majority, you're seeing them use their muscle in Parliament to push these bills through. And there's about 8 bills now amending the Indian Act. And even after the Crown First Nations gathering, the Prime Minister said there wouldn't be any unilateral amendments to the Indian Act. Well, he introduced some, after the Crown gathering. And, they're not being honest either, because this Rob Clark's introduced a private member's bill to amend certain sections of the Indian Act, like the residential school, removing estates. And to me, why is he even touching the residential school provisions when there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that's supposed to be making recommendations about what to do about the legacy of the residential schools? To me, it's offensive that he's even touching that. And he introduced it as a private member's bill. So he came in the back door of Parliament with it, when really John Duncan says the government supports it. So now it's part of their agenda. They use tactics like that to try and appear as if they're trying to do us a favor. But really, it's all part of what I call their termination plan. To get rid of our collective Aboriginal treaty rights and our pre-existing sovereignty, before they started to assert Crown sovereignty. And so that's what I'm saying is the termination plan consists of the suite of legislation, the 8 bills, the amendments to the Indian Act, because the Indian Act is going to be something unrecognizable from what we know it as it is now once all those bills pass, or if they passed. And on top of that, on September 4th of this year, Harper government announced 3 new policy measures. One was this results-based approach to modern treaty and self-government negotiations. So what they're doing is an internal federal assessment of those 92 tables across the country, and based on a series of questions they've developed, which I have if anybody wants them, it lays out Canada's core objectives in getting compromises or concessions out of First Nations on giving up their Section 35 rights in exchange to get modern treaties or self-government agreements. And basically emptying out Section 35 of any real meaning through these agreements. That's their objective. And this results-based approach, this federal assessment, is they're going to figure out which tables are likely to reach agreement and which ones aren't. In other words, if somebody's taking a hardline position and it doesn't fit with their policies, then they're going to drop the funding for those tables and only go with the tables that are going along and agreeing to compromise their rights in exchange for some money and other terms or considerations in those agreements, the modern treaties or self-government agreements. So that was announced in September of this year, just a few months ago. And then the other thing they announced is they were cutting and capping the funding for provincial territorial organizations, which will cripple their ability for chiefs to meet, at the provincial or regional level. And they're also announced in September that they were cutting advisory services for tribal councils and bands over the next 2 years. So those three announcements were made in September. So when you take those announcements up of the funding cuts and caps for political organizations, for dropping tables that aren't going their way, and looking at the suite of legislation to amend the Indian Act and other acts, like the Navigable Waters Act, C-45, that people are talking about, that will affect Aboriginal treaty rights. When you look at the whole package, it's designed to focus on individual rights to undermine collective Aboriginal treaty rights and to gradually eliminate, reserves in that over time. Because they can't legally get rid of reserves, for example, on the prairies, because they were created under treaty. So they have to come in the back door, to get individuals to want to go for fee simple or, to get the lands designated for non-native economic development, if they're next to urban areas, things like that. So that's what these laws are designed to do, is to, erode the collective rights and the reserve land base over time. And so it's way more than C-45, like Out and No More has been talking about, in terms of the Harper agenda. And basically, this has been 40 years in the making. The Liberals were behind it, and the policies Harper's using are actually Liberal policies, the self-government policy and the land claims policies. But the legislation is designed by his government. So he has to take, the responsibility for that one, because that's coming from him. And so basically, that's what I wrote about in my last newsletter. And I basically said, if First Nations are quiet about this, they may as well shut up about rights and just accept Harper's economic plan, because, it'll be too late if people are quiet. So I was glad to see the I Don't Know More movement start, because I think it's done a lot. I don't think Harper would be meeting next week without the I Don't Know More movement. With all due respect to Chief Spence, I don't think he'd care about another Indian dying, quite frankly. But what he's concerned about is where this political movement's going and will it affect the economy of the country. So he's worried about it because it's growing. And I think he wants to shut it down. So I think that's why he wants to meet with the chiefs and enlist them to help shut down the people from doing political action. But I understand from what I'm seeing on Twitter and that a lot of the grassroots people aren't too happy about that. So that's something, I guess, that the people have to talk about with the leadership, is what they want them to present to Harper. Anyway, that's what I've written about, and that's what I believe. I believe it's about emptying out Section 35 of any real meaning, because, as I explained it in my video, there's the old Constitution and the new Constitution. The old Constitution was Section 9124, the British North America Act from 1867. That's where they passed the Indian Act and, colonized us. That's the colonial system. Section 35 was supposed to be about our future in Canada and accommodating, recognizing and affirming Aboriginal treaty rights. But they haven't done that because they've diverted our leadership into these negotiations on negotiation tables and agreements under these policies, which they unilaterally developed. We didn't have any say. They didn't consult us on these policies. And basically, they're defining our Section 35 rights in these policies, the self-government and land claims policies, because they're saying take it or leave it. And because most can't afford to go to court, a lot of them are going for the only game in town, which is the federal offers. And what that's done is I haven't counted them up, but if you look at the 92 tables across Canada, they're representing hundreds of bands. So there's hundreds of bands that are locked into this negotiation system that are heading towards terminating their rights in exchange for some cash and some delegated authority. Because that's all you get out of this stuff, government policy is delegated authority, not jurisdiction. And I'm not a lawyer, you can ask lawyers that, but if they're honest with you, they'll tell you that's the case. Anyway, I think that brings us up, I think, to where we are. I think the I Don't Know More movement started reacting. I think, observing it, I think it started when everybody saw the leaders trying to get into the House of Commons and that scuffle on December 4th. I think that's what triggered the people in the I Don't Know More movement, because they saw the leaders weren't being listened to by the government. And I think that's when the action started to happen. And then shortly after that, Chief Spence started her hunger strike. So I think that's what triggered a lot of the political stuff. I know you guys have been active out there getting involved in it, but it's certainly gone international now. But in the end, we're still facing Harper's termination plan, and he's going to try and finesse it through next week at the meeting. So that's my summary of my presentation. Like I said, there's three things you can get in my video, a newsletter, and a PowerPoint I did. And between the three of those, just kind of lay out a little more detail of what I tried to explain tonight. Is okay, Roger?
Okay, Russ, would you have time for